Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. Time to catch up with Richard Kazimer, our man who's always given a mission impossible from the United States. Good morning, Richard.
Good morning. How are you, brother?
Oh, we're doing pretty well. Hey, mate, something that's been certainly was talked about a fair bit here last year during our winter. Undoubtedly, it's being talked about a fair bit in your winter, has been what's known as the H1N1 or swine flu. And I believe that first appeared in April of 2009, a bit earlier than usual.
This year was fairly healthy. It didn't pan out as bad as the Centers for Disease Control were calling for. The H1N1 pandemic peaked here in October, and that was actually before a lot of the flu vaccine was available, and then the curve went downhill since December, so fewer people were contracting the H1N1. Why is anyone's guess, considering that was before the flu vaccine was available.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, I think I had a look here in the United States. Now we talked about April 2009 was when it first appeared, which was earlier than usual. In the remaining 9 months of 2009, it resulted in 3,642 deaths in the United States. Almost all of those were attributable to pre-existing conditions. So many people would be asking the question, how does that constitute some kind of extraordinary crisis? And perhaps the big question here, probably this takes on a more interesting perspective in the United States where people like pharmaceutical companies and what have you have more of an influence. Was it more of the politicians being panicked by vaccine makers?
The people who generally make the call are the Centers for Disease Control. It's very unusual for a pharmaceutical company or a politician to come out and instill fear. The Centers for Disease Control, even though it is a government agency, those are the people that everybody pays attention to. So when they say, when the CDC says, or the World Health Organization says that this pandemic is something that needs to be addressed right away, people sit up and take notice. The pharmaceutical companies don't. The pharmaceutical companies are held accountable by why there is not enough vaccines available. But the pharmaceutical companies don't make any call as far as having people go out and get inoculated.
Yeah, but isn't it possible that they influence the politicians to tell people that they should be going out and getting vaccinated?
No, because the politicians are not in a position to be telling people to get vaccinated anyway. The politicians would be relying on the Centers of Disease Control.
So is it also fair to say that they've got a whole lot of leftover doses that nobody wants?
I can't say that for sure. All I know is we're going into another season of it. So anytime there's a change of season, particularly when there's school vacations involved, people that travel quite a bit, there's always a chance of a pandemic starting due to a lot of international travel. You see that a lot when people travel on airlines, that it spreads. So they get ready for it, but everything seems to be under control because there were fewer people contracting it, fewer deaths attributed to it, so there is a stockpile of it. The inoculations are readily available for free in a lot of cases. A lot of the larger pharmacies around here offer clinics and offer free swine flu vaccines, so it seems to be under control. The only concern is from the Centers for Disease Control that people become complacent and think, well, if it's not making news headlines because there isn't a huge pandemic and a lot of people aren't dying, then why do I need it? And that's where you run into a problem, or a potential problem.
Yeah, I suppose the big question still remains about whether or not the issues raised around it were really as serious as were made out.
That's a possibility, but the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organizations would always want to err on the side of caution.
Well, I know here that they were offering a free vaccination to everybody. I mean, initially it started for at-risk groups, which was obviously the young and the very old and those people with pre-existing conditions. I don't think among the average person that the take-up rate was that high. As to what sort of take-up rate they had among the high-risk groups, I really couldn't answer that. But it seems to me that it's not turned out to be the potential problem to the extent that many people thought it might be.
We're seeing that over here as well. The other interesting thing is that usually the people who are 65 and older make up the majority of the hospitalizations and up to 90% of the deaths. But this latest pandemic showed that people under 65, 9 out of 10 of the deaths were people who were younger adults and children.
Yeah.
So again, it's anyone's guess why.
Now moving on to another topic, childcare, which might be interesting because here, firstly, to get into childcare, there's at least a wait of a year. And, of course, anyone who operates... We have both private and government-run childcare centres. You have to be licensed to run a childcare centre. Of course, you have to apply for a licence and be granted one. The government gives what's called a childcare allowance for people on a certain income or below it. Mind you, of course, it doesn't cover all the costs associated with it. We're sort of curious as to how childcare is done in America and whether or not the issue of unauthorised centres or people running what are unauthorised childcare centres operate in the US.
Oh, I'm telling you, it does. It is a huge cottage industry over here. There are larger facilities that are licensed and come under a lot of scrutiny from the state and local governments, but then you have people who just have large homes that take in children. There's a real dividing line between what constitutes a professional child care facility and then somebody who just does extended daycare or somebody who is a glorified babysitter. Those people function under the radar. If nobody knows about it, then the child services are not aware of them. They don't inspect them as they would a legitimate child care facility. The only time you hear about that is when the child unfortunately gets abused by someone in the home, or he gets bitten by a dog, or suffers an accident or a fall. So yeah, it is an issue. It is a growing problem here in the United States.
Do people get any sort of government benefit for it? Is there some sort of subsidy through the tax system or the welfare system in the United States for childcare, or is it something that people either get from their employer, or is it something they entirely have to fund themselves?
It depends on the quality of the daycare. For people who are living in the poverty level, there are social services that provide child care expenses, and then they have to go to specifically licensed and specifically recommended and regulated social service child care centers. Medium income, high income people can deduct child care from their taxes at the end of the year. It's part of your child deduction anyway. But no, the government in general does not grant any subsidies for anyone, and that creates a problem that many people, if they can't get into a child care facility that they want, either they can't afford it or there is a waiting period, then a lot of parents choose to stay at home and become stay-at-home parents, not go to work or try to work from home until such time as they can afford to put their child in child care or get on the waiting list or get accepted.
Yeah, I suppose one of the big questions, of course, is for many people, I guess, not working would not be an option because they simply couldn't afford to do it.
That is a problem, and it's been a problem for many years, for generations. Because of the economy, more husbands are staying home, more fathers are becoming stay-at-home parents, and the wives are going to work and becoming and probably justifiably, the major breadwinner. It's an economic issue, it's a social issue. There's a lot of facets to this industry.
As you would well imagine. Now, something else that's utterly contentious, and that is Obama's support for nuclear energy. He's now come out and said that he supports nuclear energy, and that there's little doubt that liberal environmentalists are beginning to feel about President Barack Obama the way that Glenn Beck and his supporters do. And it seemed especially evident last week after the President announced $8.3 billion in loan guarantees to help build 2 large nuclear power reactors in Georgia. And apparently they're the first such plants in the United States in 3 decades. If I'm not mistaken, after 3 Mile Island, there wasn't really much activity in terms of building new nuclear power plants.
As of 2008, there's 104 nuclear reactors operating here in the United States, 69 pressurized water reactors, and then there's 35 boiling water reactors. Some of the major universities have small nuclear plants for research, and military also has various small nuclear plants scattered around the country. The last construction began in 1977, and then the last nuclear plant that went online was in 1996. To make something clear here, Obama was never against nuclear power. He never advocated against it at all.
Well, actually, having a look at his position as a senator previously, and of course as a presidential candidate, I think it reveals that he's long been a supporter of nuclear power, and I'd have to say that I think probably on this issue he's absolutely right.
When he announced that recently, there wasn't a huge outcry. I'm seeing some groundswell now from the usual environmental groups that are opposed to this, or at least looking at this with some sense of scrutiny, simply because nuclear power is not as clean as one would imagine or as the nuclear industry is professing, because for one thing, you have to get the fuel, which is uranium, and you have to mine uranium, and then you have to enrich the uranium, and then what do you do with the spent fuel again? And then the cooling water, the billions of gallons, has to be properly recycled and disposed of. So you're back into the same scenario as we were 30 years ago with nuclear power. Hopefully the technology has advanced in the new plants in Georgia.
Still one of the cleanest ways of generating energy, though, Richard. There's no question about that, or generating electricity. There's no question about that.
But the other end of it is that there are fewer deaths in nuclear power than there are in coal-fired plants. But there is never any safe level of radiation. That is an issue.
Well, of course there's a safe level of radiation. We're subjected to radiation from the natural environment every day of our life. Of course there's a safe level of radiation. I mean, to say there's no safe level of radiation, that's the sort of stuff that comes from nonsense scaremongers. It's like the same argument that people have when they talk about something having a radioactive half-life of 250,000 years. I can tell you now, mate, and it's just pulling this out from chemistry, if something has a radioactive half-life of 250,000 years, it wasn't very radioactive to begin with.
Well, let me clarify that. There's no safe level of radiation exposure from a nuclear power plant accident.
Well, who's been exposed to, apart from Chernobyl accident? The answer is nobody. And here's another interesting question. How many people die each year as a result of coal being burnt? Answer is 1 million.
Okay.
So, you can sort of see why people are saying, well, sensibly, this is something that has to be explored. Something else that has to be explored, I was reading recently an article on anthrax, and I sort of wonder, and of course, obviously this is related to terrorism, I wonder how many people are perhaps what you might call paranoid. I mean, last week we had the plane crash, which I suppose essentially was a suicide flight in Texas, where the fellow crashed into the building which contained the IRS. That would have to be an extreme reaction to the IRS, I guess. But of course, a lot of people would have thought that it was 9/11 all over again until they got word that it was in fact somebody acting with a grudge. But you sort of think about that when you look back over the years. You had the Oklahoma bomber, Timothy McVeigh, and all that sort of stuff that built up, and obviously, of course, it culminated in 9/11. Is there a certain degree of paranoia that you think exists now that is sitting always at any given time just below the surface?
The Republicans would like you to always be paranoid and always be afraid that Obama and the Democrats are soft on terror and that we're always 1 second away from another attack and that America isn't safe and that sort of stuff. I don't know. The difference between Joe Stack, who ran his plane to the IRS building, and the closing of the case of Dr. Bruce Ivans, who the FBI concludes was the gentleman who sent out the anthrax letters back in 2001, you get into the minutia of what actually quantifies a terrorist. If that's the case, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was a terrorist. Timothy McVeigh certainly was a terrorist because of what they're doing. Is there some sort of manifesto? Are they against the government? Do they want to disrupt American way of life? That's what constitutes it. But then you can always say that people who are gang members, bikies, are terrorists because they disrupt the whole legal system and they terrorize the communities that they work out of. You kind of have to leave it to the experts as to what constitutes terrorism and what just constitutes somebody who commits a crime in a copycat fashion. Joe Stack, for example, many groups here in the United States don't believe that income tax or any taxes are constitutional. They go back to the American Revolution of taxation without representation and say that they just don't feel that they need to follow the rules. And then he gets slapped with thousands and thousands of dollars worth of fines. He was his own worst enemy, that he did not want to pay taxes like every American should. He was slapped with many fines by the IRS and went on this 6-page diatribe on his website about how wrong it was, and then set his house on fire with his wife and daughter in it, and then ran his plane into an IRS building. What is the difference between this guy and somebody who shoots up a McDonald's because they didn't like the way he was served his hamburger?
The answer there can be that often the difference between them is actually negligible. It's just what they do, and the way they go about doing it might be different, but the net result always ends up the same, doesn't it?
Maybe we should all be less concerned about labeling somebody who commits these sort of crimes and trying to figure out why they did it in the first place and what we can do to prevent it. What are we going to do about this sort of person?
Well, the answer is until or unless they do something, what can you do about that kind of person? I mean, you get to a point where you look at somebody like that and say, okay, well, I mean, how many people, and I wouldn't begin to imagine what the figure might be, would find themselves falling foul in some way, shape or form with the IRS, which, by the way, is the equivalent to a tax inspector. How many people would find themselves falling foul of that in some respect or another and wouldn't feel particularly nice about them? There's a vast difference between that and actually deciding to do something like fly a plane into their building.
Looking back at Dr. Bruce Ivans, here was somebody who the FBI has concluded after hundreds of thousands of hours of research, I mean, this happened in 2001, they had him as a suspect and then another gentleman who worked in the same laboratory as a suspect, whom they cleared later on, and he sued the FBI and won. The scrutiny that went into finally concluding that Ivans was the person, he acted alone, was down to figuring out the DNA of the anthrax itself. But when you've got a guy who's like Joe Stack, who verbally and blatantly issues these manifestos, it made it known to everyone around him that he was against the IRS and hated the government. And then you have Bruce Ivins, who never sent a letter in the anthrax that he sent out. Nobody knew why these envelopes were showing up. So you've got somebody who makes a statement and commits an act of violence, and somebody who commits an act of violence and doesn't make a statement at all. Are they terrorists?
Take your point. Richard, as always, a pleasure. We'll talk to you next week.
All right, brother. Looking forward to it. Thank you.